My sisters and I got to take turns setting the table for supper every evening. It was exciting until I was about 8. After that, it was less so. But laying out the plates and the silverware in the correct pattern, which, by the way, is the correct pattern we were taught to use, was very important, including a folded napkin folded the proper way, so that all you had to do was lift the fork slightly and pull the corner of the napkin down across your lap. Not pick it up and shake it out and set it down. Well, that earned extra praise from Mom. And one of the duties of setting the table was taking 3 slices of white bread, putting them on a plate, and setting them by my father's place. For Dad, a meal was not complete unless he had several slices of white bread to eat, along with whatever was being served that evening. And he ate it just like that, plain, no butter, nothing, just ugh. But anyway, my dad grew up very poor. They didn't have much money for food, and so his family ate white bread and hamburger, which was considered poverty food in those days for most meals. In fact, bread and hamburger was his favorite meal throughout his life. We'd go out to fine restaurants and he would get chop steak because it reminded him of hamburger. For Dad, bread was a way to connect with his past and his present. Bread had meaning for him, I think, beyond filling his stomach. It was part of his ritual of food. The 6th chapter of John's Gospel is an incredibly busy chapter. It begins with Jesus feeding a large crowd with 5 loaves and 2 fish. And that night, his followers and he got into a boat to sail to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. And of course, a storm came up, brewed up. Jesus was asleep. His followers woke him. He calmed the storm. They finally got to the west bank of Galilee, which, by the way, in John's Gospel was the first time that they ventured into Gentile territory, and discovered that the crowd that had been with Jesus eating had gone around the shore to meet him on the other side of that large lake. And Jesus looked at them thinking, I just can't get away from you people. And then he said, you followed me because I fed you with bread. But I've got to tell you, I am not just bread. I am the bread of life, come down from heaven. Like manna given from God to Moses and the Hebrew people when they were in the desert, Jesus would feed their bodies and their souls. It would be a reminder that God was always present. Now, John's Gospel took a much different approach to the sacrament of communion than the other 3 Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke placed communion during the last few days of Jesus' life on earth. And the bread symbolized Jesus' body being broken for the forgiveness of sin. The cup of wine was Jesus' blood poured out to provide healing and give his followers new life, much like a transfusion is supposed to do today. And the tone of the ritual in the first 3 Gospels was very solemn, because everybody knew that Jesus was going to be betrayed and he would probably die on a cross the next day. John's tone, however, was not at all solemn. In fact, John wanted his readers to know that the bread that was in the manna, the bread that was Jesus' presence, and the bread that was in the sacrament were all ways for his followers to connect with Jesus and the God that he represented. The bread of the sacrament was meant to remind followers that Jesus and God would always be present with them. For Jesus, the bread and the cup in John's Gospel were meant to be very good news of comfort and hope and joy. The early church found its connection with each other and with God through the breaking of bread and drinking from the cup. In fact, early worship was actually a meal where members of the congregation would come around a table, usually in a wealthy person who could afford to feed that many people, where everyone in the congregation was present to eat and to celebrate being together. Because being a person of faith following Jesus was still outlawed at that time. And so the conclusion of their time together was always the breaking of the bread and drinking from the cup. It was a reminder that until they met again, Jesus was present with them. They were connected to God through the presence of Jesus in their lives. They were connected to each other by the presence of Jesus they found in the bread and the cup. The bread of life, Jesus, was that great presence and connection that reminded them no matter what they faced, they were never alone. When the followers were confronted by Roman soldiers, when they were thrown into prison or threatened with violence, they weren't alone. Jesus walked with them, and the community of faith was there to support them. When they fell on hard times, as many Christians did because they lived in ghettos of poverty, other followers of Jesus in the community of faith were there to help them because they were the presence of Jesus found in the bread and cup. When followers died, the bread and cup reminded those still alive they were connected to their loved ones by that great communion that was being served on earth and in heaven. When followers left the area to pursue safety or perhaps jobs elsewhere, they knew they were not alone because the bread and cup bound them together through the presence of Jesus and the presence of God. A few weeks ago, I had the honor of officiating at service for a friend who had passed away. And this week her husband wrote to tell me about an experience he had had after the day she died. He was working in his living room, which he usually didn't do, and had the television on with what he called very loud and annoying music. At one point, in his words, he simply lost it. And in the midst of his grief and his anger and his fear, he shouted out, "God, I need help." Immediately the television grew quiet. And he looked and saw a woman in a long gown, and she began to sing, "You Will Never Walk Alone." Message received. These two people, as a couple, had been together for many years. I think up to 6 decades. And they had worshiped faithfully every Sunday and received communion many, many times. And this man knew that it was the presence of Jesus and the presence of God that still bound them together in love and God's presence. I've moved 7 times in my pastoral career. This Tuesday will be the 8th. And every time I've moved, it's been a time for memories and reflection and gratitude. Now, the first 5 moves demanded that clergy preach in the former congregation on the last Sunday of June and the new congregation on the first Sunday of July. Right after we had just left the former congregation, without any sort of break between the 2 congregations. That first Sunday was always a bit stressful, to say the least. Correct, Nancy? Yeah. Thankfully, the conference has gotten a little bit wiser and kinder since then, but that first Sunday in the new place was always hard, meeting new people, trying to remember their names, figuring out what the ritual was in this new church. And like most pastors, I missed the people and the familiarity of the former congregation. Given those first Sundays were communion Sundays, even though I wasn't sure how that particular church did things, I always found comfort knowing that we were all taking the same sacrament, usually at the same time. That ritual bound us, the former congregation, the new congregation, and me together, even though we were all in different places and new situations. I think the reason I found comfort was not just the ritual, but the fact that Jesus was present in the bread and the cup. The same presence of God through Jesus our Christ that we experienced in one place was still present, even though we were usually miles apart. Now, I suspect we all have people in our lives we miss terribly. They may be at home with God, they may be at home in a different part of the world, they may be absent in our lives for a number of reasons. This morning we may wonder where God has gone. We may be feeling lost or lonely, or we may be filled with gratitude and feel great to be alive. Whatever we're feeling, this morning the sacrament of Holy Communion is a time to experience and to claim Jesus' presence in our lives, our connection with God, and our enduring connection to each other. Because we do not walk alone through this world. Jesus and every other follower of Jesus walks with us. Makes me wonder if maybe like my dad, we should all have some slices of bread with our supper. Amen.